Welcome to the Commonwealth Policy Center's Facebook Live special presentation. Here with us this morning, we have a special guest, Congressman Andy Barr, who represents the 6th Congressional District, which is the Bluegrass region of Kentucky. The major city there is Lexington. Congressman Barr, welcome to the program.
Richard, great to be with you, and thanks to the Commonwealth Policy Center for all of the great work that you all do.
Well, thank you. I appreciate those kind words. Of course, we are a little bit delayed. I love technology. I'm pretty sure you love technology. Sometimes it doesn't play nice with us, so we appreciate our viewers and listeners bearing with us as we've had to work out some glitches here. Congressman Barr, we're really appreciative of your time. You've got a lot on your plate, a lot going on in Washington, D.C. Of course, you are in a re-election campaign as well. You're on the ballot both on June the 23rd and then on the general ballot in November the 3rd. About a week or so ago, I had been in touch with your office, and I had shared a number of topics that we wanted to talk about. And since then, the news cycle has dramatically shifted. A lot has happened in the last week. And I would like to talk about a number of other things that have happened in Washington, D.C. and across the country as well. But let's start with the CARES Act. That was the original topic where I really wanted to sit down with you and pick your brain about this record stimulus bill that you and your colleagues in Congress passed into law back in March. In fact, it wasn't just one stimulus package, but there have been, I believe, it's 3 of them altogether, if that's correct, or some form or fashion. Four. So we're on 4. So we're on 4.0 now. Correct?
Right. And 5 if you're counting some smaller technical corrections bills.
Okay, so a number of stimulus bills that were enacted. When this went through back in the first one, the major CARES Act went through in March, it was essentially a $2 trillion bill, and the goal was to ward off a major recession in the nation. The coronavirus has, of course, a very serious virus. Our health experts warned us to take certain precautions, and that led to a number of businesses closing down. So Congress did respond and pass this record $2+ trillion CARES package. Are you concerned? I was looking at your website, and one of your campaign points, one of the things that motivated you to run for office in the first place, when you were first elected in 2012, you ran on the platform of fiscal responsibility. You were concerned about the national debt. In light of that, did this stimulus package concern you as to adding another $2 trillion onto the national debt?
Absolutely. It worries me very much that the Communist Party of China forced us to borrow an additional $3 trillion to deal with this pandemic as a result of the cover-up from the Chinese Communist Party that led to the spread globally and cost us 113,000 American lives and counting, 40 million unemployed Americans. And as you said, forced us to borrow an additional $3 trillion. I voted against a bill that Nancy Pelosi put on the floor, a partisan bill that was embarrassingly unrelated to responding to the pandemic, that would have added an additional $3 trillion. And it's very distressing that, over the course of the last 8 years of my service in Congress, that I have voted so many times to cut spending, reform wasteful government programs, rein in wasteful government bureaucracies, only to have my vote be in the minority and not carry the day. Consistently co-sponsoring the balanced budget amendment, supporting measures of fiscal responsibility, trying to reform programs like the National Flood Insurance Program and the government-sponsored enterprises like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and huge drivers of our debt like runaway entitlement spending, and then voting against appropriations bills that were too large and directed resources in ways that dishonored the taxpayer. So yes, it's obviously very, very difficult when you're forced to borrow more money. But I came to the conclusion after speaking to top economists and the chairman of the Federal Reserve, over whom I have jurisdiction, the Treasury Secretary and others, is that if we did not act to deal with this government mandated, government imposed shutdown, we were going to lose not thousands, but millions of intergenerational family owned businesses, farmers, barber shops, hair salons, flower boutiques, retail, hoteliers. It was going to be a total depression-like disaster if we did not provide a lifeline. And one thing, Richard, I would point out that's very, very different between this economic shutdown that we experienced over the last 3.5 months versus, say, the Great Depression or the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. Those other economic slowdowns were really business cycle phenomenon, certainly the result of bad public policy and government policy, but they were more conventional, traditional business cycle recessions or contractions. That's not what we had here. What we had here was the greatest economy in a generation, the lowest unemployment in 50 years, economic growth, record highs in the stock market, low labor unemployment, high labor participation. It was a very, very strong economy. And what happened was the government shut it all down.
Yeah.
The government intentionally mandated a shutdown of the economy, maybe for good reason, maybe as necessary to respond to a public health emergency. But nevertheless, I view it as a taking. I view it as the government taking private property away from the American people. And the American people were not allowed to earn a living. They were not allowed to go to work. They were not allowed to run their businesses and put food on the table. And therefore, as such, I believe it was altogether moral and appropriate for the government to compensate the American people for this shutdown. And I do believe that it would have been more costly to allow these small businesses, these Main Street mom and pop businesses that are responsible for most of the jobs in this country. It would have been more costly if we had allowed them to go bankrupt and go under. Those are the employers and small businesses that are going to lead the jobs recovery on the back end.
Yeah, very good. And that, put it that way, it seems like the only alternative for Congress and for those in authority to deal with the downside and the tremendous pain it was going to cost so many of the particularly small business owners. In hindsight, and we can all be Monday morning quarterbacks, but in hindsight, as to how we dealt with the pandemic, this total shutdown in many sectors of our economy, but we can look at other countries. I'm thinking particularly South Korea, I believe Taiwan. There were parts of the at least South Korea. I'm not sure about Taiwan. Other countries dealt with this in a different way, and they had better results. Knowing what we know now as to how other countries dealt with this, if this does emerge again, is there a better way for the United States to deal with it? Is there a more a precision-like approach to deal with this instead of a across the board, one size fits all solution dealing with this? For example, we do know that rural states are not impacted as states that have big metropolitan areas. New York City is very different than West Kentucky. I'm talking to you right now from Trigg County, far West Kentucky. We had maybe a dozen or so cases the last I looked at the numbers. Very few cases here. We can look at the state of South Dakota. They allowed much of their economy to remain open, and the number of deaths in South Dakota per capita was the same as Kentucky. And yet Kentucky essentially Governor Beshear shut the economy down. Unemployment was nationally, we were number one in unemployment in the country. And yet compared to South Dakota, they did well, minimal impact on the economy. And we have not done as well. What are your thoughts as far as if this does emerge again? Is there another path forward to keep our people safe and to minimize the negative impacts on the economy?
Those are great questions, Richard. And the governor of South Dakota, Kristi Noem, is a good friend of mine. I served with her in Congress for 6 years, and she's an outstanding governor and a great leader. We've learned a lot, I think, over the last 3-4 months about how to respond correctly to something like this. Of course, this was unprecedented in modern times. So, to a certain extent, officials had to innovate and do things for the first time and try different things. But we've seen how different governors and different officials responded, and how some officials, like the governor of South Dakota, did it the right way, and how other leaders, like I would say the governor of New York and the mayor of New York, did it absolutely the wrong way. And I would credit President Trump for doing it the right way. Number one, he took the sound advice of public health officials, including Dr. Fauci, who has been criticized in some quarters for shutting down travel from China early on. He was criticized for being a xenophobe for doing so, but Dr. Fauci credited that decision for slowing the spread into the United States. That was very important. Now, of course, the Chinese Communist Party could have saved the world. One study says that we would have slowed the spread or prevented 95% of the global worldwide cases had China actually allowed the whistleblowers in Wuhan to alert the world. But they didn't. They shut it down. They covered up. They had a disinformation campaign, and that allowed this disease to spread and escape China. The Chinese Communist Party, by the way, Richard, they shut off travel from Wuhan to the rest of China, Shanghai, Beijing, and other major cities, but they allowed people to leave Wuhan for international travel outside the United States. So President Trump's early action to shut down travel, even while Nancy Pelosi and other left-wing politicians were criticizing the president for doing that, very important in terms of slowing the spread. We also, I think the president also did it right by harnessing the power of federalism, allowing the federal government to issue guidelines, but allowing governors and local municipal leaders to actually implement the guidelines in accordance with the particular situation in their respective states. So, to your point, in places that in rural America where you don't have density of population and therefore community spread is lower risk, it makes sense to not have the draconian measures that we saw in other places. When I say New York got it wrong, look, New York is a tragic situation. We had most of the deaths and the hospitalizations up there. The hospitals were overrun, like in northern Italy there. And so our hearts our hearts go out to those folks up in New York. And my colleagues who I talked to, it was just a very difficult time. But you see some critical errors. While Mayor de Blasio was criticizing and politicizing the pandemic and criticizing President Trump, he was moving and ordering people to go to movie theaters early on. He was also, and I think this was the really critical error, he was telling people who were running nursing homes to send convalescent hospitalized senior citizens back into nursing homes after they were in the hospital. They were still shedding the virus when they went back into the nursing homes. And so while Governor Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio were criticizing President Trump was doing it the right way, and they were doing it the wrong way and exacerbating the spread in New York. I would say one other thing: we need to get our supply chain much more resilient. A lesson learned is that we need to decrease our dependence on communist China in terms of our personal protective equipment, our masks, our gloves, the manufacturing of critical pharmaceuticals. The real nefarious thing that happened after this became a global pandemic was that the CCP weaponized the global supply chain. And one top communist Chinese official was reported of saying is, we are going to throw the Americans into a sea of coronavirus as they vacuumed up critical personal protective equipment that they make most of in the world and also hoarded it. So we need to hold China accountable for all of that. And we need to become much more self-sufficient and resilient in terms of our medical supply chains.
Yeah. Congressman Barr, what you're sharing is extremely troubling about how China acted when they first discovered this and how serious it was. They did not take immediate action, but then the follow-up to punish us, to withhold the PPE from us. One of my observations is that the mainstream news media has been reluctant to criticize China and put the blame on them where it rightly is due. We're seeing that on top of that, we're seeing certain governmental leaders say that it's racist to call this the Wuhan virus, even though other viruses have been named according to their origin, SARS, for example. But we have this kind of a politically correct approach to dealing with this, and particularly towards China. You know, to the point about governmental leaders considering this racist. San Antonio City Council recently called it hate speech to call this the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus, which I don't know if we've seen that. It's clear, you know, that there is bias in the media, but it's particularly troubling when you're dealing with a health crisis for them to not report fairly. How do you deal with this? So I guess here's the question. There is a question in here somewhere. How do you deal with the mainstream press, news media, that is not being accurate or fair in their reporting on something like this?
Well, you call them out, you try to write op-eds and letters to the editor to provide a countervailing viewpoint. But let's face it, the news media is corrupt and in many quarters, and they're not reporting the facts. They're an agenda-driven part of, and they're allied with the far left wing in this country. And that's just sad. I mean, because we do need unbiased news reporting as opposed to agenda-driven partisanship from journalism. And journalism is in a state of crisis in this country right now. And it's not just the sin of commission where there is a biased reporting. I think one of the greatest sins of journalism today in America is the sin of omission, the fact that they're not covering the real story. The real story it shouldn't be about political correctness. It should be about truth telling. And the truth is that this is a virus that originated in China. It is true that 2 years ago, scientists from the US Embassy in Beijing went to the Wuhan Institute of Virology and were so alarmed by what they saw in terms of deficient security protocols, in terms of the inadequate training of the scientists and the researchers, the fact that they were studying 50 different strains of extremely contagious, risky coronaviruses from animals, including bats, that they reported back to the US State Department in sensitive but unclassified cables that this could start a global pandemic. And 2 years later, here we are. We have received, as you may know, I was appointed to a China task force. We have received a number of classified briefings from the State Department, from the intelligence community, from the National Security Advisor. I had a meeting with Robert O'Brien and his deputy, Matthew Pottinger, National Security Advisor and deputy to the president, in the Situation Room with my colleagues on the task force. I will tell you, we will be releasing a report, and we will be declassifying some of this. But the bottom line is the American people are starting to wake up that not only is China to blame for this global pandemic, but we need to prepare the United States and the people of the United States for a multi-decade strategic competition with a rising global superpower in China that threatens our interests and the interests of our allies. And unlike the Cold War, we have never faced a totalitarian country that is this integrated into the global economy, nor have we faced a totalitarian adversary like the People's Republic of China, that is a technological totalitarian dictatorship, communist regime, meaning that they are a total police state using modern technology, artificial intelligence, surveillance to crack down on their own people. They are more afraid of their own people than they are of the United States or other adversaries around the world. They are a major threat, and we need to prepare we need to prepare the United States militarily, technologically, from a science and space and cyberspace standpoint, economically, in terms of our energy capabilities and our economic resiliency, and from an ideological point of view, because we remain the beacon of freedom and capitalism and markets throughout the world, prosperity, democracy, and an open society that will be the aspiration of the world. And we are confronting a closed, communist, technologically totalitarian regime that is a threat to all free people.
Yeah. Very good. Those are strong words, Congressman Barr, and in some respects, it's refreshing to hear you speak strongly about it. I don't hear that often enough. I think we uh, fail to realize how dangerous and how totalitarian and how China is very different than us. Many people in this country do not understand what it's like to live in a police state, how a heavy-handed authoritarian government acts. People use that term cavalierly here when they speak of President Trump, and they really have no idea what it's like to live under a communist regime. Speaking of President Trump, he
Right.
at
And
his
Rich, I'm
direction.
sorry, can I just interject one thing?
Yeah,
Sorry,
sure.
I
Go
don't
ahead.
want to, I don't want to stop your flow, but you started the question with political correctness. We cannot afford political correctness in our confrontation and our strategic competition with China. The city council of San Antonio, they know not what they do. If they had the intelligence reporting that I have, they would not be doing what they're doing.
Yeah, very good. So at the direction of President Trump, he has withdrawn US funding of the World Health Organization. He believes that they're complicit in not addressing this correctly and not being forthright with some of the information that they had early on, as I understand it. Was that the correct move to withdraw funding from the World Health Organization?
It was because the leadership of the World Health Organization, Tedros, and the rest of the top leadership of the World Health Organization is totally corrupt, and they've been co-opted by the communists in Beijing. They repeated the lie, the Chinese communist lie of no human to human transmission. They enabled the spread of this pandemic. They have blood on their hands. To be the global public health organization, it is a disaster to see the role that they in fact played in enabling the spread of this disease and resulting in 113,000 American lives lost. So absolutely, this president was standing up for the American people, for the families of Americans who have lost loved ones, for Americans who have lost their jobs, for taxpayers who now are saddled with an additional $3 trillion in debt because of not just the mismanagement, but the malfeasance of the leadership at the World Health Organization. Now, let me just say this also as a caveat. There is a reason that the United States should engage in international organizations like the World Health Organization once we reform them. We should use the power of our purse exactly the way the president has to punish the World Health Organization for their corrupt leadership. And we need a change in leadership. We need pro-Western, American-friendly leadership at the World Health Organization to counter Chinese aggression. I think a complete withdrawal in the long run would enable China to continue to perpetuate lies and jeopardize world public health. So I think it's important that we engage reform and engage the World Health Organization, reform it so that there's real science and American science and health being promoted within that organization so that we can actually promote public health worldwide as opposed to cover up pandemics caused by China.
Very good. Congressman Barr, I'd like to pivot to another issue that has transpired in the last week and a half to 2 weeks. And of course, I'm talking about the murder of George Floyd at the hands of a Minneapolis, Minnesota police officer. This video was horrible to watch. Of course, it has sparked protests and in some cases violence in some of our major cities. In the city of Seattle, there's a 6-block area that has been declared an autonomous zone. The police precinct within that area has vacated. There is no police presence. President Trump has called on the mayor of Seattle, Jenny Durkan, to bring order to her community. President Trump has said, to act and to act swiftly. What are your thoughts on that? Is that an issue for Congress to be concerned about when you have a major city that has a portion of it that's at least lawless? The police don't have a presence. They've had to vacate one of their offices there. Is that a concern for Congress?
Well, sure it is. And let me just first say that the tragic death of George Floyd was a total injustice. And Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, in our own state, we've seen cases of misconduct and cases that are tragic, and those families certainly deserve justice. And racism does have a long and painful history in our country, even in our state. Last year, I was very proud to have petitioned the Trump administration to designate Camp Nelson in my district as the first and only national monument in Kentucky. And President Trump signed this proclamation at my request to reinvigorate the inspiring story of freedom of enslaved Kentuckians that escaped to Camp Nelson to join the Army of the Ohio to fight for their liberty, to put their lives on the line, to fight for their liberty and for their families. And Camp Nelson was a place that we need to lift up, especially in this time of racial tension in our country, and draw on the strength of Kentucky's history there to encourage reconciliation and to seek justice and honor the flag and the pledge that we recite to honor the flag, which says justice for all. Yeah. And there should be justice for all. And we should continue to strive to keep that promise of the Constitution of equal protection under the law, regardless of race. And so we've got work to do. But I think as we condemn racism, as we condemn those isolated cases of police misconduct, and I say isolated not because they're when we see them, we should just throw them under the rug. Absolutely not. We should call them out and we should condemn them. But what I'm saying is the vast majority of law enforcement officers, Black, white, Hispanic, Asian law enforcement, most of them are good people. Yeah. But to the point about Seattle, and this movement to defund the law enforcement as a response, it dishonors the memory of George Floyd. It dishonors the memory of Breonna Taylor, because what it does is it puts vulnerable communities at risk. What it does is it's a dangerous idea that would deprive much needed resources to law enforcement agencies so that they can prevent police misconduct, so that they can recruit and retain the best and brightest, so that they can provide proper training to law enforcement officers. And when you actually consider this crazy idea that the far left is promoting in this country of defunding the police, they're only going to get more cases of police misconduct, because you're going to have the wrong people in the uniform. You're going to have law enforcement officers who don't get the adequate training that we need. So what we need to do is reform law enforcement in a way that actually honors people like victims like George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, by providing additional resources for law enforcement to give them better training so that these injustices never happen again.
Very good. Very good. I'd like to pivot to another topic. We've got just a few minutes until we need to close. Speaker Nancy Pelosi is calling for 11 Confederate monuments to be taken down in the Capitol Visitor Center. Two of those monuments include Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens, the president and vice president of the Confederacy. This is what Pelosi said in the letter to I believe it was the Capitol Library Historic Commission, if I'm correct. She said this: "While I believe it's imperative that we never forget our history, lest we repeat it, I also believe that there is no room for celebrating the violent bigotry of the men of the Confederacy in the hallowed halls of the United States Capitol or in places of honor across the country." Just read that this morning, Congressman Barr. I don't know if there have been previous conversations that you've had with your colleagues about those monuments. Of course, in the case of Stephens, he was a U.S. Senator before he became the vice president of the Confederacy. Jefferson Davis was as well. Also a Kentuckian, Jefferson Davis, born in Fairview, Kentucky, not very far from where I am broadcasting this morning. What are your thoughts in general about Confederate monuments in the U.S. Capitol Visitor Center?
Well, it just shows how ineffective Speaker Nancy Pelosi as a leader. Uh, you know, I don't hear anybody calling for the dismantling of the Democratic Party, which was the party of slavery. What I think we need to focus on to actually solve the problem, and not do things that are ineffective in solving today's problem. The problem is that we have terrible cases of police misconduct that need to be rooted out. And we need to reform law enforcement by actually resourcing law enforcement so that they can provide their law enforcement officers with the proper training so that they can recruit and retain the best and brightest good people, honorable people. And I'll tell you, when we talk about law and order, of course we need law and order, because when you think about what happened to George Floyd, that was the opposite of law and order. That was excessive force violating the Constitution, violating the Fourth Amendment. Law and order is civil rights. Law and order is preventing police misconduct. Law and order is striving and achieving equal protection and justice under the law. And in that vein, I just want to say, in terms of condemning both cases of racism and cases of rioting and violence, and the tragedies that we're seeing in our streets, I just want to mention a few other victims in addition to George Floyd. Yeah. Dave Patrick Underwood, a Black police officer in the Federal Protective Service, shot while guarding an Oklahoma-California federal courthouse during unrest in the city. His sister said that my brother was murdered while on duty during the riots. This violence must stop. How about David Dorn, a retired African-American police captain who was killed in St. Louis while protecting a friend's pawn shop from looters? His death was captured on Facebook Live, during which an onlooker cried out, "They just killed this old man at the pawn shop over some TVs. Come on, man, that's somebody's granddaddy." Dorn was a father of 5. He had 10 grandchildren. Chris Beatty was an African-American former offensive lineman for Indiana University. He was shot dead in an alley in Indianapolis after leaving a peaceful demonstration that had turned violent. Italia Marie Kelly, a 22-year-old African-American woman in Davenport, Iowa, shot in the back while getting into her car trying to escape a protest that had turned into a riot. These are wonderful Americans who did not deserve to die. And we should honor every American, and we should defend every American's right to peacefully protest and fight for justice and fight for equal protection. Now, I stand with those peaceful protesters, but I certainly do not stand with criminals who kill these innocent African-American patriots fighting for law and order and fighting for change and justice in their communities. So let's honor the life of George Floyd. Let's honor the life of Breonna Taylor. Let's honor the life of these martyrs by defending the First Amendment, defending peaceful protests, and defending law enforcement when they act properly, which they most often do, to defend the peaceful activity of the American people.
Very good. Congressman Barr, we have just a moment here. I want to end on this note. You are on the June 23rd ballot here in Kentucky. You do have a number of Republican challengers. Is this issue that we're talking about, the protests, the injustice towards George Floyd, defunding the police, are these major topics for you right now in your reelection bid?
Well, they should be, and I hope they will be. And I am certainly supportive of some reforms that I think, again, would actually make a difference, not just ineffective political statements. I think we do need to look at accreditation of law enforcement officers and law enforcement agencies to hold those agencies accountable. I think we should support more transparency measures in law enforcement departments. Funding for body cams to help both officers and citizens for transparency. I think more money for training would be a very, very good thing, and rewarding those law enforcement agencies that are doing the right thing and training their officers and recruiting the right kind of officers and engaging in the right kind of discipline when there's misconduct. So to me, that is a way for us to achieve reconciliation in this country, achieve law and order, and equal justice under the law.
Very good. Very good. Congressman Andy Barr, any final words before we close out this interview?
Well, look, there's a lot at stake in the upcoming election, and there are two competing visions in our country right now. One is a vision of socialism and chaos and disorder, and the other is a vision of robust capitalist free enterprise that appeals to the best aspirations of the American people, built on limited government and an orderly structure of our society where we lift up civil society. Those are the two competing visions in our country right now. And, I think it's very, very clear which is the right road to go on and which is the wrong road. And I am so grateful that we do have leaders in this country, my colleagues in Congress, in the China Task Force, and the president, who are finally stepping up and facing the threat we face from the communist China, the communists in Beijing and China, because I think that is also going to be a very defining issue in the upcoming election. And I think the other side is simply putting their head in the sand, and they're not confronting this very serious threat.
Very good. Congressman Andy Barr, I personally appreciate your leadership in Congress. I appreciate your stand for American ideals. Best to you in the upcoming June 23rd primary, and we need to do this again sometime.
Absolutely, Richard. Thanks so much.
Thank you. God bless.
God bless.